By far, the most disturbing evidence against the Kinsey reports is the information pertaining to the sexual behavior of children. This was something noted in the 1950s by Professor Albert Hobbs, who wrote that, according to Kinsey, a child molester may have contributed favorably to a child's later sociosexual development. The child sexual data was more fully exposed by Dr. Judith Reisman in the 1980s, who brought the even more disturbing allegation that Kinsey had trained multiple pedophiles to molest children while using stopwatches to record so-called scientific data.
This man, this Kinsey, had been responsible for the rapes and tortures of hundreds, actually, it looks like thousands of children.
Needless to say, the Kinsey Institute today denies Dr. Reisman's allegations. They maintain that all of the child sexual data came from one man, who just happened to keep detailed scientific records of his encounters with children.
Damn many.
This lone pedophile theory was developed by Dr. John Bancroft, who became the director of the Kinsey Institute in 1995.
One pedophile
Bancroft not only argued that the data came from just one man, but that Kinsey supposedly only got hold of the information years after this pedophile was finished raping kids. This is contrary to Kinsey's own report, in which he admitted to at least 9 pedophiles from whom he obtained information. But in this 1995 interview on Canadian television, Dr. Bancroft says that Kinsey only referred to 3 or 4 pedophiles, and then insists that in reality it was only 1. When questioned about the obvious inconsistency, Bancroft's argument is that Kinsey simply lied about his research. Listen now as this Canadian journalist seems to get uncomfortable during the interview.
Did he make it clear in the report that the conclusions on the sexual capacity of 317 children were based solely on the evidence of one sexual criminal?
No, he suggested that it may have been from 3 or 4. I don't think that is a particularly important difference. Kinsey...
But isn't that conspicuously misleading?
I think he was misleading. I think that he...
I'm sorry, you don't think he was misleading? Forgive me?
Yes, I think he was misleading, but I don't think it was a misleading of any consequence. He was concerned about his maintaining confidentiality. Throughout his volumes, he tended to avoid drawing attention to any particular individuals.
It's not significant that the conclusions of a study on the sexual responses of children come solely from a man who really has who's a deviant? Doesn't he have a skewed perception of child sexuality?
Well, that was just one type of evidence.
Next, the journalist asks why it took so long to discover that the information came from a single pedophile, rather than multiple pedophiles, as Kinsey had reported. Bancroft's only answer is to say that he worked it out once he became the Kinsey Institute director.
Why did it take so long to set the record straight?
When I got to the Kinsey Institute and these accusations were continuing, some people were expressing, some otherwise reasonable people were beginning to worry about these accusations and saying, well, now, how is it that if he's got information from 3 or 4 men, he can standardize it in such a way that it goes into a table, unless somehow or other he's trained these men to make these observations. People were beginning to express that concern, therefore I decided to look more closely at the source of information, and that's when I realized that actually, as far as those tables were concerned, the information all came from this one man who had been collecting this information in an extraordinarily methodical way throughout his life since about 1917.
And you knew of this for how long? That it was that Kinsey was misleading in this?
I worked out that there was one man involved soon after I came to the Kinsey Institute, and shortly after that we issued a press statement from Indiana University making this point clear.
So, I'm sorry.
That was at the beginning of September.
What the criticism is also, and it's significant, is that Alfred Kinsey was guilty of academic dishonesty, and if the Institute if the Institute would have been more forthright, the people from the political and religious right wouldn't have the kind of ammunition that they now have to try to not only discredit Kinsey, but the teaching of sex education in schools.
There is no reason to say that Kinsey has been dishonest. He probably had a good reason for obscuring whether it was 1 or 3 men. That is a minor detail.
The minor detail of Kinsey's data may have had a major impact on America's children, especially when one considers that now, decades later, 1 in 4 teenage girls are currently infected with some kind of sexually transmitted disease. And according to the White House Office of National AIDS Policy, in the U.S., it is estimated that 2 young people, aged 13 to 25, are infected with HIV each hour. Is this the devastating fruit of Kinsey's sexual revolution? Furthermore, should Americans trust information about child sexuality from child molesters who were raping kids? As Dr. Bancroft has admitted, Kinsey's pedophile data directly impacts sex education in America.
The specific findings about these children are totally irrelevant to modern sex education.
But where did Kinsey get his information? Did it really come from just one man? The allegedly lone pedophile that Bancroft and the Kinsey Institute point to was known as Mr. Green in Kinsey's research. His real name was Rex King, a man who kept written diaries in which he claimed to have molested more than 800 children. Like most pedophiles, King was never caught and never served a day in prison. The Kinsey Institute usually presents King as a man who simply kept meticulous records and mysteriously came into contact with Kinsey. This same idea was presented in the Hollywood film Kinsey, starring Liam Neeson. But what Kinsey supporters do not reveal is that Mr. Green had been personally trained by Kinsey's mentor, Dr. Robert Dickinson. Something admitted by Paul Gebhardt in the 1998 British documentary, Kinsey's Pedophiles.
Kinsey was told about Green by his own mentor in sex research, Dr. Robert Dickinson. Dickinson had collaborated with the pedophile for several years and taught him how to record his child abuse in scientific detail.
He told him how to measure things and time things and encouraged him to, he knew he was going to do his ordinary behavior anyway. Dickinson couldn't have stopped him from being a pedophile. But he said, at least you ought to do something scientific about it, so it won't be just your jollies, it'll be something worthwhile to science. So he gave him some training by letter and correspondence.
Gebhardt has also admitted that Mr. Green's child abuse data played an important role in the Kinsey Report's view of child sexuality. Gebhardt said, Green contributed a fair amount to our knowledge and medicine's knowledge of sexuality in children. We made our point that children are sexual from birth. But the sexuality of these children was determined because, according to Kinsey's interpretation, the children supposedly enjoyed the molestation while it occurred.
If we're talking here about science, you do not ask a rapist if his rape victim enjoyed the rape, and then translate that to the American public as science. Well, nobody minds being raped. They all enjoy it. We asked these experts, and the experts have told us the experts were the rapists.
Dr. Clarence Tripp, one of Kinsey's original team members, offered this comment on Green's molestation of children.
Well, here's this man with hundreds of contacts. There was never a charge against him. He was never arrested for anything. All the children thought he was wonderful. All the mothers thought he was wonderful. There are two, I suppose, lest you get contradicted, there are two instances in which a young boy or girl, I guess it was, I don't remember, didn't complain. They agreed to the sexual contact, but then they found it very painful and yelled out when it actually took place. This was because they were very young and had small genitalia, and Green was a grown man with enormous genitalia, and there was a fit problem.
The idea that the children enjoyed being molested by Mr. Green is shocking enough, but the suggestion becomes even more appalling with the testimony of Jonathan Gathorne Hardy, a Kinsey biographer, who is one of the few people who have been allowed to view Kinsey's private records. Speaking about their practice of keeping files secret, Hardy said, "The Kinsey Institute is nervous people will read the journals. Rex King described having sex with this little girl, this little boy. I think the Kinsey Institute felt right-wing figures would pluck out things. I think they are right to keep them under cover. There are descriptions of King buggering boys nigh on 13 who doesn't enjoy it. I mean, it's quite sort of harsh stuff, some of it." But the most disturbing evidence comes from Kinsey's so-called scientific tables, wherein he describes the sexual responses of young children.
When I was reading Kinsey's book in the first place, and I looked at the tables, table 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and these were tables with ages of children on the left-hand side, and then orgasm in one panel, and timed orgasm, time of orgasm in the next one.
In Kinsey's tables 31 through 34, he documented the timed orgasms of children as young as 2 months old, recording their responses down to the 10th of a second. The findings are so extreme that one child, a 4-year-old, is said to have had 26 orgasms within a 24-hour period. For Dr. Reisman, the obvious question was, where did Kinsey get such information?
And I looked at those charts and graphs. I can't tell you how long it took me to try to process what I was seeing. This is the torture of children.
At the base of Table 31, Kinsey tells us that the data is based on actual observation of 317 males. Then on page 177 of the male volume, Kinsey writes, orgasm is in our records for a female babe of 4 months. But how would anyone recognize such a response in a young child? Kinsey wrote that among pre-adolescent boys and among younger females, orgasm is not so readily recognized, partly because of the lack of ejaculate.
And so I said, what did this man, this Kinsey call an orgasm? Right. I mean, it's an obvious question, isn't it? I mean, first of all, this was not possible, but second of all, what did he call? Well, I saw he documented it on page 160 and 161 in Kinsey's book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. He described specifically what he called an orgasm amongst these children.
Kinsey defined orgasm for pre-adolescent children with the following description: a gradual and sometimes prolonged build-up to orgasm, which involves still more violent convulsions of the whole body, heavy breathing, groaning, sobbing, or more violent cries, sometimes with an abundance of tears, especially among younger children.
They didn't enjoy the shit, motherfucker!
And he said there were 6 categories. He called them 6 categories of orgasm, and he had category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And included in these categories of what he called an orgasm were screaming, writhing in pain, hysterics, especially among younger children. He put that in parentheses, especially among younger children, parentheses. He said that the children had convulsions. Those were his words. He said they fainted. He said they struck the partner. He called it the partner. This is the man who's raping the child. Okay. They struck the partner and tried to get away. And he said that those were all examples for him, of orgasm.
Kinsey made it clear that this data was supplied by adult observers, who were defined as pedophiles by Kinsey's own team members, as you will hear later on. Kinsey wrote, some males suffer excruciating pain and may scream. The males in the present group, by which he meant pre-adolescent boys, become similarly hypersensitive before the arrival of actual orgasm, will fight away from the partner, and may make violent attempts to avoid climax, although, he said, they derived definite pleasure from the situation.
It's too much.
Kinsey biographer James H. Jones was a 1998 Pulitzer Prize finalist for his biography on Kinsey. In the Yorkshire documentary, Jones had this to say about Kinsey's description of child orgasm.
If you read those words, what he's talking about is kids who are screaming, kids who are protesting in every way they can the fact that their bodies, that their persons are being violated.
At that point, reading that, I said, the only person who could
I see
write
why they
that
didn't want
would be,
nobody
number one,
reading
a
them damn
pedophile or a
files and
pederast,
locking
'cause these
them
were
up.
boys. Was homosexual abuse of boys.
That institution shouldn't
And
even
the
be.
sadomasochist. That is
Oh
the
my goodness,
only
this is
human
just out of
being
control.
in the world
On a level that
who
is
could call
unreal.
an orgasm something that involved people throwing up. I mean, having convulsions,
You look like
fainting,
the fucking
screaming,
devil.
crying. The only person who could do that is someone who experienced that themselves. And that had to be a sadomasochist. And the only person who could apply their sadomasochism to an infant and a child would be a pederast, a rapist. And that's what Kinsey did in that book.
Kinsey's own sadomasochistic tendencies have been documented by a number of biographers. James Jones revealed that Kinsey once climbed into a bathtub and circumcised himself with a pocket knife without the benefit of anesthesia. Another account of Kinsey's extreme self-abuse came about when his research was under investigation. Jones reports that after the Rockefeller Foundation withdrew his funding, Kinsey went to a basement, tied one end of a rope to an exposed ceiling pipe and the other end around his scrotum, then stood on a chair and jumped off.
The abuse that he inflicted on his organs, on his sexual organs, were very directly identified in his death. That was orchitis. That was a serious inflammation and disease that he inflicted upon himself that was basically involved in his final death. Now, the attempt to claim that Kinsey died of a heart attack is a perfectly reasonable thing to try to do. It's kind of embarrassing to say that the father of the entire sexual revolution, who has trained all of our sex educators in the United States of America basically, died because he had so abused himself doing the activity that they tell everybody is okay, that he died of this terrible and very painful experience.
If Kinsey's abuse had only been inflicted upon himself, his critics might be less likely to accuse him. But his abuse extended to children, the most precious members of our society. In this image, Kinsey seems to take a demented sort of glee in showing these young children a film of two porcupines engaged in a sexual act. He seems oblivious to the confused and even disturbed looks on the faces of these children.
Fucking traumatized them.
Was it this same lack of concern that enabled Kinsey to support and even encourage the most depraved sexual criminals?
Oh my God.
The evidence shows that Kinsey was not content to work with merely one pedophile, as Dr. Bancroft and the Kinsey Institute claim.
Is mentally fucked
Following
up.
the example of his mentor, Dr. Robert Dickinson, Kinsey set out to train his own predators, men who would collect information about what can only be called the sexual torment of children. Dr. Clarence Tripp was Kinsey's photographer who filmed and photographed sex scenes in the attic of Kinsey's home in Bloomington, Indiana. In 1990, Tripp was interviewed on The Phil Donahue Show, along with Dr. Judith Reisman, who appeared to defend her first book, exposing Kinsey.
Well, don't look now, but they're attacking Dr. Kinsey again. The book is titled Kinsey, Sex and Fraud, The Indoctrination of a People.
During the show, as Clarence Tripp began to defend Kinsey's research, even Phil Donahue, with his liberal views on sexuality, became uneasy at some of Tripp's bizarre comments about the molestation of children.
We should say that you are the author of The Homosexual Matrix, a book which got quite a positive response from...
I want to agree with Reisman on one point. I think we really ought to talk about the child stuff before we mix in the
Right, well, make your point,
homosexual stuff. You know, we really shouldn't go too fast there. We want to savor that because it is wonderful. It's so delicious what she says. I want to draw you a picture of the image. The image is that the world-famous sex researchers, or Dr. Kinsey alone, it's not quite clear, are in a room, and they hover over a young child, less than a year old, and with their fingers or feather, that's not quite clear, they tickle the genitalia and bring this kid to orgasm, who is screaming and hollering and possibly held down by chains.
And drugged.
It's all too glorious.
Well, make your point. I hope that you don't. You're being sarcastic, but I want to make sure.
I didn't mean to be sarcastic.
You're saying this isn't true, that Dr. Kinsey or his colleagues did not.
This is the man who was with me on Donahue saying, you got to stay with this. It's delicious what she says about what they were doing to the children.
Dr. Reisman refused to go on Donahue unless he would agree to show Kinsey's tables, where the child sex abuse data is presented. Despite knowing about these tables, Donahue repeatedly insisted that no proof existed of child abuse in Kinsey's research. Nevertheless, he did show the data to his audience.
Well, we're going to show.
There.
Now,
read
what is the point?
You
what is
tell
your
me
point?
what is the point. 5 months old. What is it? I can hardly read it. What's next to that? Number of orgasms. Oh, number of orgasms, 3. Go down to the 4-year-old. You see the 4-year-old there?
17, yeah.
There, bottom one.
Yes,
4-year-old, 26 orgasms in 24 hours. Tell me, Phil. Tell me, Phil. Does a baby sleep? Tell me, Phil. Tell me, Phil. Does a baby sleep? Tell me if this is scientific. A baby sleeps for 8 hours? You tell me how you get 26 orgasms for 24 hours.
We've got to be able to get a word in edgewise.
Just a minute.
Sounds like a guest for the Donahue show.
And you know what Gebhardt said to me? You know what Dr. Gebhardt said? He wrote me a letter, which I wish you had up there too, in which he said that oral and manual techniques were used on the children. Now, Phil, I'm going to say that once more. And if I'm wrong, let them sue me. He said oral and manual techniques were used on those children.
The letter that Dr. Reisman refers to was written by Paul Gebhardt on March 11, 1981, in which he attempted to explain where the child sexual data came from. In this letter, he admits that multiple pedophiles were used in collecting information for the Kinsey reports. Gebhardt writes, "Since sexual experimentation with human infants and children is illegal, we have had to depend upon other sources. Some of these were parents. A few were nursery school owners or teachers.
Oh my God.
Others were homosexual males interested in older but still prepubertal children. One was a man who had numerous sexual contacts with male and female infants and children, and being of a scientific bent, kept detailed records of each encounter." Gebhardt went on to say that some of these sources have added to their written or verbal reports photographs, and in a few instances, cinema. The techniques involved were self-masturbation by the child, child-child sex play, and adult-child contacts, chiefly manual or oral. Gephardt's letter clearly refutes the lone pedophile theory of Dr. John Bancroft, but fits in perfectly with what Kinsey documented in sexual behavior in the human male. Gephardt's mention that photographs and cinema were sent to Kinsey also explains the discovery made by former Kinsey Institute director June Reinisch in 1984.
This was Newsweek in '84 when June Reinisch said, that the Institute encourages visitors and so forth. And she says, what's her name? Reinisch says that she found a collection of child pornography so distasteful to Reinisch personally, she couldn't bear to look at it. All right. Now, she's not asking where that child pornography came from, right? But some of it was.
Now, she found this at the Kinsey
Institute, yes. Yeah, at the Kinsey Institute. And John Bancroft, who wrote about Kinsey and supported Kinsey for years before he was hired as the head of the Kinsey Institute, right? Who's supposed to be an expert on Kinsey, which was why he was hired by the Kinsey Institute, now suddenly claims that everybody knew all along that these children were being raped by one pedophile. Well, he's the expert on Kinsey. Why didn't he ever write about it before he got hired? Why did he have to go into the Kinsey Institute to look into it if it's all laying out there? He knew that it wasn't a couple of pedophiles, which he said at one point. It wasn't one pedophile, which he said at another point. Kinsey said it was 9 pedophiles. That's what he wrote. And it certainly would have been at least 9, because we now know from Yorkshire Television that Kinsey was working with a group of pedophiles.
There was also a pedophile organization in this country. They cooperated with us, and some of them who were not, of course, not incarcerated, they came and they gave us information.
Dr. Reisman believes the pedophile organization mentioned by Gephardt may have been the nucleus for what would become NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. While child molestation is